Hello, fellow, I'd say Araxians, but I'm not just speaking to Araxians today. Friends, compatriots, fans. Today I want to talk about something that's very near and dear to me. It's a company I've been following for going on 20 years now. Before we dive in too deep, I want to give you guys a quick heads up. This is a long one. It's a very good one. I would argue the most important one I've made to date. But I couldn't find a way to cut it down. That being said, it's also a good one to listen to in the background of something else you're doing. Unlike my meta series, you don't really need to watch to walk away with the meat of this video. Anyways, let's dive in. It started all the way back in grade school. Through usual ups and downs, one bright spot was always when the PC Games magazine would show up. For a week or so, I'd play through with the demo CD that accompanied the magazine. And that would keep me occupied because my budget was all tied up in the magazine subscription and I couldn't actually buy any of the games. That'll change when I stumbled across an unassuming title on the February 1998 PC Gamer disc. Striking a deal with my parents, I dropped my magazine subscription and rolled it into a subscription for Tanarus, a groundbreaking for the time tank simulator. 4 teams of 5 did battle across urban landscapes. Vanguards, mag riders, and lightnings dominated the scene and did battle with plasma cannons, phoenix missiles, and lancers. A lot of these things are ringing a bell, aren't they? The maps never ended. The different colored teams would push back and forth and take control points where tanks could resupply. It may not look like a whole lot, but you gotta think back to this era. It was a whole bunch of sports games, a whole bunch of real-time strategy games, and very basic generic FPS games. At the time, a 3-dimensional multiplayer tank simulator was mind-blowing. It was just on a whole different plane of creativity. Now, it's a little bit tricky to follow what was going on at this time, but let me give you a quick rundown. The original developer of Tanarus and the roots of SOE was Sony Interactive Studios America. In '96, a guy named John Smedly was put in charge of developing an online role-playing game for this studio. In '98, the year Sony Online Entertainment was formed, Sony Interactive Studios America was renamed to 989 Studios. Only months later, 989 became fully committed to making sports games for the PlayStation console. The online computer game branch was spun off, originally Red Eye Interactive, and finally landing as Variant Interactive, founded in part by John Smedley. Being a huge fan of Tanarus, you can imagine how excited I was when Variant Interactive announced a 3D, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. Hopefully you already guessed the title. Making it in as a beta tester for EverQuest was a pretty thrilling experience, even though it was just the phase that would be considered open beta today. For the second time, this company pioneered the field in what a certain genre of game could really be. At the time, Meridian 59 was the only 3-dimensional MMO RPG to speak of. And Ultima Online dominated the market, still 2-dimensional. Walking into this wildly immersive, 3-dimensional, living, breathing world, I fell in love with Variant Interactive all over again. Although Variant was always closely aligned, it was officially absorbed by Sony Online Entertainment in 2000. It continued to release expansions for its flagship product, EverQuest, and it further pioneered the field with 2 more groundbreaking titles in the year 2003. One was a partnership with LucasArts in Star Wars Galaxies, and the other was a massively multiplayer first-person shooter called Planetside. I loved Star Wars Galaxies, but I didn't have a rig that really allowed me to play it. And Planetside's clunky first-person shooter mechanics and maxes intruding into the infantry combat kept me from really enjoying that game. I stuck with EverQuest as an RPG and Counter-Strike titles for my FPS fix. Now in 2004, a certain saying comes to mind. Pioneers get slaughtered, settlers prosper. I don't want to take away from the fact that EverQuest was absolutely a hit and a very successful game. But, without a doubt, John Smedley and Variant Interactive with EverQuest were the pioneers, and Blizzard Entertainment with World of Warcraft were the settlers. Backed with huge financial strength from the success of their real-time strategy games, and taking notes from the pioneer that was EverQuest, Blizzard came out with the undeniable hit that was World of Warcraft. And so I was gone. Even though I dearly loved Sony Online Entertainment, and came back to visit EverQuest every now and then, for all of World of Warcraft's shortcomings, the experience as a whole was more accessible than EverQuest. So SOE clipped along without me. I certainly always kept my eye on them, but they weren't really releasing any groundbreaking titles. I enjoyed running my guild in World of Warcraft, but I always longed for something more. And in 2012, that something came with Planetside 2. Built from the ground up, art assets that would blow the old Sony Online titles out of the water. And by now, the mechanics for first-person shooters were pretty well dictated and universal. Sony would have to comply. And boy did it deliver. We forget how epic Planetside 2 was when we first walked into it. Yet again, the Smedly-headed studio delivered something groundbreaking. Now in 2015 came the end of an era. Sony Online Entertainment was sold, and shortly thereafter, John Smedley stepped down as the CEO. Now I think different people will chalk the departure up to different things. Some will probably rest it squarely on John's shoulders, say his segment was underperforming and Sony had to ditch him. Others will peg it directly to the parent company, Sony. They were cash-strapped, and selling off a small segment is a great way to make ends meet. Others might chalk it up to his high-profile battle with the notorious hacker group Blizzard Squad. And some people, frankly, don't care. They were just glad to see him go. Myself, I recognized him for what he was, a rare gem in the industry. Most CEOs of gaming companies are in the industry to find profits, and they will hunt down games that can generate those profits. John Smedley was the opposite of that. He was a gamer who had lofty ideas of what great games could be, and went into the industry to find a way to finance those games. I am certain there is nothing he would have loved more than to just be a creative director. But it takes more than just a good idea. It takes finding investors, and it takes building a company. And so Variant was founded, what we know as Daybreak Games today. He hunted down talented creative directors, be they your Brad McQuaids or your Matt Higbees. And certainly, as CEO, he had the final say in a game's direction. But taking up the mantle as the CEO really doesn't allow you to get into that creative process. His job was to be a shield, really more of a sponge. He took up a position between the creative teams he built and the investors on the front end and the consumers on the back end. Let me expound on what I mean by that. Creative teams are very fragile. It's not easy to get all the right people in the right place and keep them financed long enough to produce something. We see all the success stories out there in the market, or when we're looking down a game list on Steam, but for every one of those success stories, there's 10 failures. And a good CEO, like John Smedley, fights to protect those teams. They absorb all the bad that is directed at those teams and threatens to break them up. When he had to go sit down in front of Sony and let them know they had to take a write-off for his segment that year because he had a few things in production and didn't generate a profit, all that bad could have been directed at his segment in the form of layoffs. But he'd go to bat to keep his creative teams together because he believed in what they could produce. And like most projects, you never get as much time as you really want. Deadlines had to be met, products had to be released to the market, even if they weren't necessarily ready. And when that happened, the buck still stopped with Smedley. He would have to go out there and absorb the bad from the community as to why the game got released in the state it was, convince them to remain loyal followers, and continue paying for the products to finance future development. And even though a lot of those issues really fell further down the chain to a producer or to a creative director, they were his creative team. The buck stopped with him. He took responsibility and he absorbed the bad. And the reality is, you can only absorb so much bad. I think John Smedley knew that time had come. And rather than risking the company go to the point where the only solution was to dissolve, he went out in a blaze of glory. He absorbed the final bad of a significant round of layoffs in order to make the company healthy. He found an investor that would want to keep Daybreak Games intact, rather than sell to some gigantic gaming corporation that would simply dismantle it and use it for its parts, like its wealth of intellectual properties. He even went so far as to create an agreement with the fan-run Project 1999 EverQuest emulator in order to protect them from legal action from the future owner of Daybreak Games. John Smedley was a passionate gamer first and foremost before he was ever a CEO. And even though he was eternally overpromise, underdeliver, his underdeliver in the form of Tonorus, EverQuest, Star Wars Galaxies, Planetside, Planetside 2 was miles above anyone else. Yes, there were some glaring errors, but don't forget to judge him as a sum of his parts. Okay, we're going to take a brief intermission. Hit that pause button for a moment and go make yourself that bag of popcorn you've been wanting. You deserve it. Otherwise, let these high-tech art assets and sound effects from almost 20 years ago in EverQuest 1 dazzle you for the next 5 seconds, and then we'll get back into it. Okay, this is where we bring it all back as to why this is relevant for Planetside 2 right now. There is no John Smedley looking out for the game anymore. There is no CEO that will regularly get on Reddit and have discussions with the community. There is no CEO that will keep a full-size development team on long after the release of Planetside 2 because he knows there is more potential that hasn't been realized in that game yet. Planetside 2 no longer has the luxury of the John Smedley shield. It's just a scrappy little segment on a balance sheet that will have to prove its reason to exist every single day. So is it doing that? I'm hearing this phrase a lot lately. Vote with your wallets. And it certainly rings out very true with Planetside. But I think people are a little bit misguided on how exactly their wallet vote is tallied. My line of work is project management. I'm in residential construction, so I don't claim to know exactly how project management works in software development, but I expect there are some principles that cross industries. Before Daybreak embarks on any development for any one of their titles, but in this case Planetside, I would expect they scope the work. That's when they sit down and figure out just how much capital they need to get the job done, and is it commensurate with the expected return on investment. So they'll go through and, based off of historical data, decide how many hours they need from each person. Let's talk on the construction system first. Daybreak's last big development push for Planetside. So we need an artist to develop some assets. We calculate how many hours we need and what he costs per hour. And that's not just his hourly rate. That's payroll taxes, that's healthcare, that's 401k contributions, and then you got to throw a share of the overhead on that employee as well, your building, your liability insurance. And all of a sudden your entry-level artist is a lot more expensive than just the dollars he takes home. On top of that, we need a guy to make some UI changes, show where the hives are on the map, and update the VP system. Well, that guy might need a little more time, and he costs a little bit more per man hour. And then we need some really expensive guys that can go in there and actually code the functionality of the construction system into the game engine. And these are probably pretty senior level guys with master's degrees. These guys are super expensive. Now we're really racking up the bill. But we run our analysis and we decide we can sell enough construction items and packages to justify the capital expenditure. So it hits the open market. What happens? We're going to use me as an example, because unfortunately I think I'm akin to a lot of people in Planetside. I spent $0 on the construction system. Those are game-killing results. And it's not because I hated it. I just wasn't super amped about it, and I didn't really need to spend any money to unlock the entire system. Being a long-time player, I had unlocked most everything else. I was sitting around on extra certs and didn't need to save them for anything else, so slowly dumped them into unlocking construction objects. Now, I think a lot of people will say, that's okay, you voted with your wallet against the construction system. And that's not accurate. I voted with my wallet against capital expenditure on Planetside 2. At this point, when you aren't spending the equivalent of a membership every month, what you're saying is we don't want Daybreak Games to develop this game any further. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow when you see something you don't like go into the game, such as the implant system. But the developers, from a project management perspective, would be doing a disservice to the owners of the company if they went in any other direction. Okay, one final quick break, and prepare yourselves, because when we come back, we're going to step into Wrel's shoes. So, Sony goes through a huge amount of layoffs, changes its name, all in preparation for a sale. They get through that ugliness, they come out the other side, they assess their financial situation, they decide they have room for another developer on the Planetside 2 team. Now, whether you like him or not, I would argue that Wrel is one of the most passionate Planetside 2 players out there. So much so that he made a career out of it. How many of us can claim that? There is no one that did more for the game that wasn't a full-time employee working on Planetside 2 than Wrel. And I personally am glad they picked someone in the community that's passionate about it, rather than a faceless person that has a laundry list of credentials but hasn't spent time in the game. So that's it. Wrel's living the dream, right? Passionate player turned developer. Well, not quite. It's more like Daybreak Games stuffed all the broken pieces of Planetside into a basket and just dumped it on him. Here, fix it. Planetside 2's problems didn't start when Wrel got there. They started in beta. The days of Higby, T-Ray, Malorn, all these other guys. And everyone likes to look back with rose-colored glasses at the good old days. But the glaring faults in the game, namely the lack of a metagame, started right off the bat. This huge hole was easily ignored in the beginning, with the dazzling art assets and the groundbreaking combined arms gameplay. But that stuff can only dazzle so long. There's a point where you have to establish an endgame, a metagame. And that didn't happen. All the resources went into performance improvements, changing continents, adding continents, and a whole lot of balance changes. Planetside 2 is now like Planetside 1. It's not a failure, but it certainly isn't a success. And its only real value to Daybreak is to offer one more game on their All Access membership. As long as it stays out of the red, it will limp on for a very long time. But Planetside 2 has a small, dedicated, passionate development team, and they don't want that. They sit around and chatter just like we do about lofty ideas of what they'd like the game to be. But they don't get to chase those ideas until they have ammunition. And it starts with small, achievable changes that have demonstrable results in terms of revenue growth. Wrel and the rest of the team just put out a fantastic implant system. I know, unpopular opinion. It removes the horrible energy mechanic. It removes the terrible, clunky crafting system that was just painful to use. And I would argue the least liked part about it is the most important part. You can't consume it in 2 days. I see these players complaining, hey, I dumped 10,000 certs into it and I didn't get what I want. It means the system is correctly tuned to require more than what free-to-play provides to unlock the entirety of the system. And that is key. These systems need to put players in a position where they have to pay to unlock them. If people want this game to grow, everyone that plays it needs to spend the equivalent of $15 a month. I have played since beta, and sadly I do not fall into that category. That means if you played from the start, you should be into this game for at least $800. Can you say that? I certainly can't. I bought Alpha Squad, bought some Station Cash, was a member for a while, but am I even into it for $500? It costs more than that to keep a game with dedicated servers and a full-time development staff running for 4.5 years. I think for a long time now, a lot of people have been unintentionally voting with their wallets to stop development on Planetside 2. This patch is a pivotal point for the game. It is asking the question, can players absorb monetization that this game desperately needs in order to ever grow again? There is no Smedly that's going to maintain a large development team just because the game's a passion project to him. It is imperative that the team continues to only take on small projects that has a commensurate rate of return to the capital expenditure. If they don't, the financial analysts up above them, who are just doing their job, will instantaneously cut this game down. So, the team is certainly greater than Wrel, but he is the most public-facing member of it, and he is faced with trying to save a game that was handed to him in disastrous condition. Wrel and the rest of the team will continue to put in front of us solutions to monetize the game. It will be up to the community if we can absorb them and hand back to the developers the ammunition they need to say, hey, let's spend more money on this 5-year-old game and do something great with it. Myself, I'm going to try to do a little bit better job of pulling my own weight, and it starts right here with the implant system. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and I will see you Planetside.